This is the Black Empowerment Show with Sista Shanice, giving you an African-centered worldview perspective. Keep it locked this way, it's the real deal. Bucky Josada. Badapa thing, play by the great king.
Sista Shanice in the house. If you're hearing my voice, it means there's breath in your body. It means it's a new day. A new day for you to be working towards accomplishing all the goals and aspirations that you have painted up inside of you. Tune in to Sista Shanice on Galaxy Afiwi, the only de-brainwashing station. Every Wednesday for Black Empowerment shows and alternative Saturdays for the community talk shows from 10 a.m. through to 1 p.m. Join the discussions, join the debate, and get involved. You can tune in via www.galaxyafiwi.com, or for Android phone users, go to Play Store and download the Galaxy Afiwi app, or find us via TuneIn in the app. Sista Shanice in the house, in the house. Galaxy Afiwi, providing a platform for the voiceless to be heard. Spread the word. That's right. Rising up the entire Galaxy family. Certainly delighted that you're locked on to the Big G Galaxy Afiwi, the only deep brainwashing station. Sista Shanice in the house, coming to you live and direct from London town. We've got a great show lined up for you today. Certainly hope that you're going to be keeping it locked in. Spread the word to your family and your friends. We have to rise up the late, great Robert Mugabe. We are the ones who have to remember our heroes and our sheroes.
Yes, we will praise you.
Want to rise up the Zimbabwean musicians on this particular track here, rising up and paying a tribute to Mugabe.
Yes, we will praise you. Revelation warrior, come on and take your place. Yes. Oh, great Zimbabwe.
Great Zimbabwe indeed. Beautiful tribute to the great late Robert Gabriel Mugabe, rising him up every time. We're the ones who are going to have to celebrate, our greats as we do here on the Big G. Rising up Galaxy family, Sista Shanice in the house. Yes, and I'm running through the first part of the show because I want to make way for our guests that we've got lined up for you today. So keep it locked for to the Big G, okay? We're pushing the boundaries as always to try and bring you news and information, okay? So this is a community platform. Galaxy Afiwi is here for you, the community, so that your voices, otherwise, silent voices, or the voices that the mainstream media, choose to ignore, we're here to enable you, the Galaxy family, to have that voice. So make good use of it, okay? There was another unknown caller trying to come through. If that was my guest from South Africa, please do call again. And if that was not, and it was you calling through because you had a quick fire announcement, the line is now free. Quickly get your announcement in, okay? Go ahead, my brother. You just managed to slip in.
A couple of announcements.
Go ahead.
Saturday the 7th of March 2020, 12:45 p.m. to 2 p.m. Africa Talks, the Global Legacy of African Women Writers. That's at the London School of Economics, the Sheikh Zayed Theatre in the new academic building. Saturday the 7th of March 2020. Speakers include Sister Elder Margaret Busby from Ghana, Sister Sarah Ladipo Manika, who was raised in Nigeria and has lived in Kenya, France, Zimbabwe, and England, and Sister Angela Wachuku, who I think was raised in Kenya. So it says African literature is increasingly esteemed around the world, but the true extent of its global historic influence remains largely overlooked. Negotiating the common obstacles of race, class, and gender, African women writers have long confronted crucial matters of independence, freedom, and oppression. That is Africa Talks, the global legacy of African women writers, London School of Economics, Saturday, 7th of March, 2020, 12:45 till 2 p.m. The second one I want to mention...
Before you move on, my brother, sounds like a great event. How do we get tickets? Is it on Just Tickets or Eventbrite? Is it a paid event? How much? Do you happen to know?
No, I think it's free.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this is an event where you have to pay money. I would suggest you go to the London School of Economics website or go to LSE Events and simply key in the global legacy of African women writers. I don't think this is not a paid event, sister.
Okay, great. Okay,
right.
yes, carry on.
The second one I'll mention very quickly, the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. This isn't until the 23rd of April, but I'll mention it now. Legacies of Colonialism in the Modern World series, and this particular discussion, the Windrush Generation and the Hostile Environment. Amelia Gentleman, Guardian journalist and author of The Windrush Betrayal, Exposing the Hostile Environment, which was published last year, a European journalist who has done a lot of work on this issue, in conversation with our sister, Dr. Juanita Cox of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and the co-founder of Guyana Speaks. This is at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, not Wednesday, I'm not sure what day of the week it is, but it's the 23rd of April 2020, 5:30 p.m. until 7:30 p.m., and the address given is the Woburn Suite, the ground floor of Senate House, Mallet Street in WC1. That's where the centre of the University of London is, I believe, from times when I used to wander around in those areas. Probably time to remind people of that event nearer the time, because that isn't until the 23rd of April. But advance notice, the Windrush Generation and the Hostile Environment, with Amelia Gentleman, the European journalist who brought this to national attention. Just finally, my sister, because I know you have other issues, just as the Windrush issue has been mentioned, I'll just finally mention free Windrush legal surgeries, Wednesdays, 5 p.m. until 8 p.m., Saturdays, 10 a.m. until 12 noon. That's at the Black Cultural Archives, 1 Windrush Square, Brixton, SW2. That goes on until the 29th of February. So by my calculations, anybody that needs free legal advice has only got this Wednesday, this evening, that is, and Saturday morning, if they want some free legal advice as a result of a partnership between the Black Cultural Archives and a firm of solicitors called Mackenzie, Biote and Pope. I think some people have already been along. Maybe they can tell us how useful they found those sessions. That's free Windrush legal advice surgeries this evening, 5 p.m. till 8 p.m., and Saturday morning, 10 a.m. till 12 noon, if there is anybody listening that has been caught up in the so-called Windrush scandal. Can I leave it there?
Yes, thank you so much, my brother, for those important community announcements. And this is my guest calling through on the other line. Okay, so I've just positioned the phone next to the microphone. Let me leave it there and see if we can make this work. So our brother Rutendo Matinyarare is calling in from South Africa, and he is Pan-African marketing strategist and brand architect, and he has been pushing for the lifting of the sanctions from off of Zimbabwe for some time. Now, although he's actually working in South Africa, he is actually a Zimbabwean, born in Zimbabwe, and has been very vocal on issues to do with Zimbabwe. So enough respect to our brother from that. But let me just allow the brother to introduce himself, and I'm just going to check the levels in the meantime. My brother Rutendo, it's an honor and a privilege to have you on the Big G. Please just introduce yourself some more for the Galaxy family.
Well, thank you very much for the platform. And like you rightly said, I'm a Zimbabwean working in South Africa. It's actually sad that I have to be specific about where it is that I'm working in Africa, because we have held on to the borders of the colonial master. We basically ratified the 1884 division and bifurcation of Africa. But I'm a marketing strategist. I studied marketing. I studied project management. And I've been practicing marketing for 21 years. And in those 21 years, I've been advancing white imperialism without understanding it. Every single time I marketed a product, created a strategy, created an execution plan for a Western product in Africa, I was enhancing imperialism on the African continent instead of enhancing African growth and Africa's ability to break colonial capitalism. And I have been using my marketing to market products from the African continent without ever asking myself who it is that I was building through my marketing activity. So every single time that I was selling or marketing a product on the African continent that was not made in Africa, that was not made by Africans, I realized that I was actually advancing Western imperialism and colonial capitalism on the continent. When I realized that, I started asking myself, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing with my skill in Africa to build Africa? Because consumerism is not an African system. Consumerism is destroying Africa. Consumerism is bringing the exploitation of Africans. So how is it that I can use my marketing skills to build Africa without expediting consumerism, which is destroying Africa? This is how I got into the fight, sanctions, fight against imperialism, and the promotion of Pan-Africanism in Africa through communication. Because what is needed in Africa is we need to build African minds to understand how to build African systems that can assist us to build a better Africa. And that is done by encouraging consumerism, encouraging hedonistic tendencies, but it's going to be done by building African minds to build African solutions and actually build Africa sustainably.
Yes, my brother, indeed.
Right, so Zimbabwe was a colony like every other African country. If people understand history, you will understand that the territories that got liberated from colonialism, the last countries to be liberated from colonialism happened to be Southern African countries. And the reason that is because the British, when Africa was divided into territories, chose the prize pieces, so to speak, the pieces where you could find the most gold, the pieces where you could find the most diamonds, the pieces that you could find the most resources. And I think everybody understands and knows that South Africa is the country that has given the world the most resources over the past 150 years, or even more resources than have been given by Saudi Arabia and the oil-rich countries in the Middle East. And that is because of gold, platinum, diamonds, uranium, and those kind of resources. Zimbabwe also has the second highest amount of platinum, chrome, and so forth. And because the British knew this, they chose those territories and tried to hold on to them as much as possible while the rest of Africa was being given independence. Even though we fully understand that the independence given to the Francophone countries was never real independence, because there was a pact to continue that colonialism through France-Afrique that we find controlling 14 territories through the CFA pact. So with Zimbabwe, we wanted to negotiate for independence in the same way that Malawi and Zambia were given independence by the British. But the British had given Malawi and Zambia independence because they did not really have much in resources, especially in the case of Malawi. With Zambia, they had copper, but there was enough copper in the world that was being exploited that they could afford to lose the territory on the pretext that the colonization of those copper mines would continue through British companies like Anglo-America. With Zimbabwe, it was a bit of a different story. They were not willing to give the territory independence. And so the Smith settler government decided to declare independence from the British. We've always believed that this was defiance of the British government, but we are no longer sure about that anymore when we look at the evidence of how it is that after Smith declared independence and he declared this unilateral independence, the British continued to prop him up, the Americans continued to prop him up, together with the South Africans, who were always, the apartheid South African government were the proxy of the British and the Americans in their wars in Southern Africa, Angola, and other territories. So the Zimbabweans decided to get assistance from the Russians and the Chinese to train our rebel forces how to fight. But before they even went to get assistance from China and Russia, Mugabe went to Kwame Nkrumah, and he asked Kwame Nkrumah to assist in the training of 50 soldiers. Kwame Nkrumah was keen to do this. Kwame Nkrumah was also keen to send his air force to neutralize the Rhodesian Air Force. And we understand that those were parts and parcel of the reason why his military eventually, which was a British-trained military, eventually had a coup and overthrew Kwame Nkrumah to stop these kind of interventions in the liberation of Africa for a pan-African Africa. And so our forces were fighting, or our guerrilla forces were fighting. There were two divisions. There was a Zanla and there was a Zipra. Zipra belonged to ZAPU, and Zanla belonged to ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, in conjunction with the unity government that they formed with ZAPU. And so they fought a struggle for 17 years until they were able to liberate the country. And this liberation of the country, because it was done militarily, we understand that the leaders of our military guerrillas, or the guerrillas, were not willing to negotiate with Ian Smith until they had totally defeated him. However, the British, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, Worcester, who was the president of South Africa at the time, were not interested in seeing the total defeat of the European settlers, because that would mean them losing their property rights. So they were more keen to have a negotiated settlement. They then approached the guerrillas. In fact, initially they had a meeting, the three of them, with Henry Kissinger from the United States involved, and they tried to negotiate a settlement that they would then force upon the guerrilla forces. But because they were negotiating at a table with the settlers and Kaunda, Kissinger, together with the South African president, in the absence of the guerrillas, the pact that they came up with, or the package they came up with, was not accepted. So eventually there was an understanding after 1976 that whatever settlement has to be reached was going to require the guerrillas to be involved. But, like I said before, Kaunda, Worcester, Smith, and Kissinger, together with the British government, did not want to involve the rebels because they believed that they were radical. But still, they were never going to get to a settlement without involving the warring party. So eventually, they had to now try to reach out to these guerrillas, people like Mugabe, Joshua Nkomo, to negotiate with them. But these negotiations were always going to be the guerrillas dictating the terms, because they were winning the war. So when they initially approached the guerrillas, they said, can we negotiate? The guerrillas said they were not interested in negotiating. They still felt they wanted to fight for another 2 years.
And when you say the guerrillas and the rebels, we're talking about the freedom fighters, yeah? The Zimbabwean freedom fighters. You know, these Europeans as well, they like to give such geography names, you know, to our fighters. But these were, you know, our freedom fighters. Yes. Carry on, my brother.
The reason I use guerrilla is deliberate.
Okay, yeah, please enlighten me then, yeah.
It's deliberate because academically, the art of guerrilla warfare has become the symbol of the independence of oppressed peoples. So this morning I posted a post on my Facebook page where I'm actually giving people the history of fighting slavery that started in Africa, but whenever slaves were caught and then taken over, people ran away from the slave ships and they became what are called the Maroons in Jamaica. And the Maroons started in Jamaica, Haiti, and the Caribbean islands. But these Maroons became so entrenched and ingrained in the countryside. And so when the English and the Spanish sent their people to try and recapture them, they ended up being defeated. To the extent that the very first treaty between slaves and oppressors, or shall I say slave master countries like Britain, was actually signed in Jamaica in 1738, where they had to acknowledge that they'd been defeated at war by the Maroons. They could not capture these Maroons, and these Maroons were beginning to influence other slaves to escape and fight the system that they had to sign the Maroon Treaty in 1738. That treaty was because of guerrilla warfare. And that treaty gave rise to Boukman Duty, who then went through and taught the Haitians in 1791 to start fighting the French. And they used the same guerrilla war techniques and the same techniques of fighting war in Africa to defeat the French. And that's how we began to bring down the system by people that were resisting European modern armies with a lot of equipment and machinery, just by African techniques of warfare that were called guerrilla warfare. And even till today now, you've got the British government going to look for Gurkhas in Nepal to fight their guerrilla wars because they, like Africans, are experienced in utilizing guerrilla tactics to fight. So anyway,
we hear you, my brother.
with these guerrilla tactics that the guerrillas used, they were able to submit the British to negotiations. Now remember, the British had said that Smith had declared independence. But now, to negotiate their peace, the British government had to get a Lord Solmes to assume control of Rhodesia and say that Rhodesia is a British territory, even though they had tried to say that they were no longer responsible for the colonialism that was taking place in Zimbabwe. So the Mugabes were invited, together with Joshua Nkomo, to stop war and to come and negotiate in 1978. They refused. They said, we still want to fight. And so when they were speaking to the people that were giving them the refuge and the camps like Samora Machel in Mozambique, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Kaunda in Zambia, they refused to go and negotiate with Smith because they felt they needed another 2 years and they would defeat Smith and be able to take Zimbabwe on their terms. The British were not happy with that. They put pressure on Kaunda, they put pressure on Samora Machel, together with the Tanzanian president Nyerere, to say that these guerrillas must come to the negotiating table. They were obviously promised some packages, they were promised some debt cancellation, and they were promised many other things that we're not really sure of, that forced people like Samora Machel to force the rebels or the guerrilla fighters to go and negotiate in Lancaster. So the first negotiations were actually not Lancaster, but actually Switzerland, and then the second negotiations were then the Lancaster House Conference. Now, we understand that the war in Zimbabwe got to a point where it could actually have turned into a world war, because Smith wanted to include the South Africans in the defense of Zimbabwe. If that happened, the guerrillas were in talks with the Cubans to come and join the war. The Americans had said that if the Cubans were to join any war outside Angola in Southern Africa again, they would intervene. This would have brought in the Russians, it would have brought in the Chinese, and probably made a world war from a little territory or little country called Zimbabwe.
Wow.
You know, so that is the background of a small group of people who happens to be students, the majority of them, 15-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds who were wearing slippers, some of them with no shoes, marched all the way to Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique to train how to fight one of the strongest armies on the African continent. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown for trying to intervene in such a war. So this little territory became a geopolitical player and had a lot of influence in the things that were going to happen in Africa and that are still happening in Africa today. Hence the struggle of Zimbabwe is the struggle of fighting or decolonizing the entire African continent. So when they negotiated at Lancaster, because the guerrillas had fought a war, because they had brought Smith to submission, and many people don't understand what we mean by bringing Smith to submission, but these guerrillas had gotten to a point where they were now bombing petro tanks or petro depots, the biggest petro depots in Zimbabwe. They were bombing those and accessing them in the city center of the capital. So that was a sign to many people that Smith's soldiers had lost the war. There were no-go areas, particularly in the east of Zimbabwe, where Smith's soldiers could no longer go because the guerrillas had totally won the hearts and minds of the people, and they had made those areas no-go areas that the rebels or the guerrillas were able to mix with the public and be able to launch attacks and then come and just mix with the public as the members of the public. And the Smith government couldn't control that. So when they got to Lancaster, negotiations began, and Mugabe, the very first thing he said is that one man, one vote, and land back to the people were the prerequisites for any negotiations to succeed. Without one man, one vote, without land being returned back to the people, they wanted to go back to war. The Smith government was not prepared to go back to war. The British were not prepared to see the Smith government being totally defeated. Henry Kissinger wrote a document that was called NSSM 39 that communicated that they could not afford for any radicalization of Africans by the total defeat of any settler power or any European powers on African soil. And we all know why he was saying that, because in Haiti, it had happened 200 years before, where the Haitians were able to defeat the French, and that is a fire that the Americans, the Europeans, went out of their way to come together to suppress so that it would not ignite other revolutions. Until today, Haiti is under suppression because of that spirit of what happened 200 years ago. The same thing is what Kissinger wanted to stop in Africa. So the negotiated settlement was agreed on. Land would be returned to Zimbabwe. For the first 10 years, it would be a willing buyer, willing seller, meaning that as a means of reconciliation, as a means of the Zimbabwean rebels or guerrillas who had now created the government to reconcile themselves with the West, they would accept to buy back land from the white settlers, but there would be a 50-50 split in the payment of that land, for that land. So the Zimbabwean government would pay 50%, the British, in collusion with the Europeans and the Americans, will pay the other 50% to buy land. Now, you might ask yourself, why did Mugabe accept such terms without accepting, first of all, reparations, and secondly, without demanding that the British pay 100% for the land return? That was reconciliation. Mugabe had a country that was under sanctions during the war, that he was taking over. They wanted the sanctions removed. They wanted a good relationship with the West and international trade relationships with the West. So they had to accept certain concessions for this particular negotiation, which included reconciliation by buying back land instead of confiscating or taking land by force. After 10 years of willing buyer, willing seller. Zimbabwe had the option of now taking the land by force, or let's not call it by force. It was called compulsory land reform. The government could now pick any land that they want to take. They would be able to write a letter to the owner of that land and tell him that they're going to take the land, and for 12 months that owner needs to prepare to leave the land, and then they would offer him a settlement. The difference between willing buyer, willing seller in this period of compulsory land reform that was going to take place after 10 years of independence was that during the willing buyer, willing seller, there was a committee made up of real estate agents, and I think you would also be able to just guess that most of those real estate agents would have been white because they were property owners. They were the people who were legislated and given the capacity by colonial legislation to be real estate agents. They were the ones that created the committee that valued the land. But after this willing seller, willing buyer period, which is 10 years after independence, then the government of Zimbabwe had the right to change the constitution into a compulsory land reform in which a government committee of evaluators would now determine the price of the farm. So what this basically meant is now they could decide that a farm is worth $1. They could determine that a farm is worth $1,000. They could now use their own discretion to determine the price of the land before they take it from the white farmer. The British, the Europeans, the Americans were not happy with this. They wanted a new land appropriation bill to be created that was similar to the willing buyer, willing seller that had been accepted after independence. Mugabe was clear that if the white farmers had wanted terms that were suitable for them, they should have sold land during the willing buyer, willing seller, which they didn't, because within the willing buyer, willing seller window of 1980 to 1990, the government was able to acquire about 3 million hectares, but those 3 million hectares were not really good quality land. They were the land that most farmers did not want. They sold them at a premium, and the government was able to only resettle 66,000 families, which is not bad. And so now Mugabe, but they wanted to have settled at least 150,000 to 200,000 families by 1990, which didn't happen. So now Mugabe and his government were now creating legislation favorable for them, changing the constitution, creating a land appropriation bill or act that was now going to allow them to take as much land as they needed. And they wanted to take 5 million hectares, but the British would have to pay for that land. The British then started playing hardball. There was a change of government. The Blair government came in. Within the Blair government was a lady from Ireland by the name of Claire Short, and she basically said that we are a new government consisting of people from different parts of the world. We don't believe in the concept of colonization, and some of us were colonized people ourselves, so we don't believe that we have to take the obligation of the British government taken by the Thatcher government. Mugabe said, that's fine. If you won't give us money to compensate farmers, that's okay. We will take the land because the land is ours. And then these Britons, or the children of Britain, can then be taken care of by Britain, but we're not going to be held ransom by you failing to meet up with the obligations of the treaty and contract, international law, Lancaster House Conference. So this is how land reform was then expedited, because Mugabe was under pressure from the people that had gone to war, the liberation fighters, the war veterans, the guerrillas, who were saying, we've had independence for 17 years and we have no land. But what a lot of people don't understand is while the land issue was playing itself out, there were other issues that were playing themselves out in Southern Africa. South Africa was negotiating for independence. Nelson Mandela was being released from prison. And so ANC in South Africa approached Mugabe just as we got to 1990 and were supposed to change the constitution for compulsory land reform. And they said to Mugabe, please, can you hold off the compulsory land reform? Can you hold off changing the constitution? Can you hold off taking more land by compulsory land reform from whites while we negotiate independence? Otherwise, the Boers in South Africa won't accept independence if you start taking land compulsory from white people. So within that period where ANC was releasing Mandela, the CODESA negotiations were happening, and they were working towards getting their independence, Mugabe had to wait But within waiting, he was disappointing some of his freedom fighters and landless Zimbabweans who continued not to have land as the process of South Africa was taking place and as Mugabe was negotiating with the British, Americans, and Europeans to take land compulsorily and for them to compensate. So that those dynamics were happening in the background. In the business circle, Zimbabwe's stock exchange became the second biggest stock exchange in Africa between 1990 and 1997. Now, why is that important? It is important because it is clear that Mugabe's economy was growing. It is also important because capital was increasing. But Mugabe had started to create what we call indigenization laws or empowerment laws to transfer wealth from white people to black Zimbabweans. One of the ways they did that is they created indigenous laws, indigenous procurement laws, or empowerment procurement laws that encouraged the ownership of companies in Zimbabwe by black people, the procurement of companies that belongs to white people.
Sorry about this. My computer is just frozen. I just need to restart it. It is restarting now. It just froze for a second. I hope that it hasn't interrupted with the transmission. I wanted to quickly announce it, but I didn't want to disturb you either, and it's just restarting now. It looks as though we're still going over, so let me just allow you to continue. Now it's opening back up. Yes, please continue, my brother, Rutendo.
Okay, so by this time, it was clear that Mugabe had grown the economy to have the second biggest stock exchange in Africa. But what was critical is the laws that ZANU-PF started making to transform that economy. So they started creating indigenization laws that shareholding in companies needs to be a certain percentage going to black people. They started creating laws on procurement policy so that there's empowerment procurement policy. So this value that was sitting on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange was starting to get transferred from Zimbabwe, from white people to Zimbabwe. They started creating protectionist laws, like for instance, the very first cellular network licenses were given between this period of 1990 and 1997, and they only gave out licenses to Zimbabwean-owned companies, which would have Zimbabwean majority ownership of 51% being owned by black Zimbabweans. And that is how the people like Strive Masiwa were created, Telus South Zimbabwe were created, and a lot of Zimbabwean, black Zimbabweans were empowered. Even billionaires that we have in Zimbabwe today were created by these policies that were made by Mugabe. Mm-hmm. When you now take the combination of, first of all, the change of land policy, the aggressiveness of ZANU-PF to change land policy, the aggressiveness of ZANU-PF to change the indigenization laws to ensure that Zimbabwe had black business owners, black industrialists, black bankers, black miners, began to become a problem to the West. It began to become a threat to the West. So the West, first of all, tried to negotiate with Mugabe. The very first negotiation was to say, Mugabe, let's sit down and let's have a land conference. And let's try and renegotiate the terms of this land process. Mugabe agreed, but there was disagreement at the land conference because Mugabe felt that Lancaster was clear, that Zimbabwe would do willing buyer, willing seller. After willing buyer, willing seller, it could then change its constitution and create its own laws on how land was to be taken. Mugabe felt he had played his part. He felt that he had bought land with Zimbabwean money, yet land was supposed to have been given back, but he had, in reconciliation, he had accepted the terms of paying for land. But now that the 10 years of paying for land had passed, he felt that he had every right, and the Zimbabwean people had every right, to create a constitution based on what would benefit the majority and what the majority wants to take land. And so now he didn't understand why the Europeans wanted to renegotiate those terms, especially after the British had refused to pay their half for compensation of white farmers. Once the land conference failed in 1998, it also so happened that Zimbabwe had been fighting a war in Congo after the Congolese president Laurent Kabila came to Zimbabwe, Harare, and asked for SADC to assist him from Rwandan-sponsored rebels and Ugandan-sponsored rebels that were being sponsored by the Americans and the Europeans to pillage Congo, were now trying to overthrow Kabila because Kabila would not allow Rwandans and Ugandans or some of these rebel movements, which were funded by the governments in Kigali and the governments in Uganda, wanted to place their own people in strategic ministries and government of Laurent Kabila. When Laurent Kabila refused that, they then started working to overthrow him. And I understand that Laurent Kabila went to Zimbabwe in 1998 in September and asked for assistance when rebels were now on the outside of Kinshasa, ready to overthrow him. Mugabe opened the discussion to SADC. Other SADC members refused to join. Angola and Namibia joined. And then from the north, Libya, Chad, and Sudan also joined Zimbabwe to go and defend Kabila. They went in, they defended Kabila in what was called the Second Congolese War. Now, it's very important for people to understand what the Second Congolese War is. It is the biggest war that has taken place in the world after World War II, and it has killed up to 6 million people in Congo. More people than in all the other wars that have been fought ever since the Second World War combined. So it is a very significant war that many Africans do not know about. Because of the participation of Mugabe and some of these other countries with Gaddafi and Sudan, al-Bashir, we got what we call the Sun City Accord, an agreement between the warring factions that brought peace to Congo and eventually allowed Kabila to continue ruling, even though he was eventually killed by Joseph Kabila, who many people say is not even Congolese. Joseph Kabila, whose mother is said to be Rwandan. But that's a different topic altogether. But before we go on, I just want to remind you that, if, like I said, when Zimbabwe went to Congo, it went with 6 countries. It went with Angola, Namibia, Sudan, Chad, and Libya. And South Africa sat out together with a lot of other Southern African countries. But look at what has happened to all the leaders that went into that war in Congo to stop American-sponsored rebels from overthrowing Kabila. Gaddafi is gone. Al-Bashir is gone. Chad has got its issues as well. Mugabe has been attacked by sanctions, and Zimbabwe has been attacked by sanctions. And that was the country that got people to go to Congo. If you go to Angola, you will see that, what is his name? Dos Santos, no longer in power. His daughter being persecuted as we speak. So there is a correlation between Mugabe going into Congo together with certain SADC countries and certain northern countries that have always been renowned for fighting imperialism in Africa. And you will also understand that right now, Namibia, which was one of the countries that went into Congo, is talking about taking back land and having a land reform like what Zimbabwe did. South Africa, ever since they changed leadership from Nelson Mandela, who refused to go to Congo, has also now been talking about economic radical land reform, or shall we call it expropriation without compensation. And that starts to speak to the reason why Zimbabwe was put under sanctions, because of its geopolitical importance in taking its army into countries like Congo and Mozambique to beat imperialism. Because in Mozambique, before they went into Congo, they also went to Mozambique to fight apartheid government financed rebels who were financed by the apartheid government and the CIA from Malawi and from the Comores. So now, you have this man who had been playing a very big role in fighting imperialism by sending his armies into places. Fighting imperialism by supporting rebel movements or guerrilla forces or liberation fighters from South Africa so that they could fight for liberation in South Africa. A man who then decided to transform his economy, give black people control of the companies in the country, give control of the reserve bank of the country to Zimbabweans, give control of the land back to Zimbabweans and giving control of the resources of the country back to Zimbabweans. This did not sit well with the Westerners. This did not sit well with white supremacy, because then everybody else in the world would start to emulate. Not only people in Africa, but people in Asia. More critically, even the American Indians, looking at what was happening in Zimbabwe, could also seek land restitution, while the Aboriginals in Australia and the Maoris in New Zealand could also do the same based on the precedents and custom that was set by Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. That is the reason why Zimbabwe is under sanctions, so that Zimbabwe doesn't work. So that if Zimbabwe doesn't work, it seems like land reform was a failure, and that will stop it from becoming an international legal precedent or international legal custom.
Zimbabwe, we hail up the name and the memory of Robert Gabriel Mugabe, for his great works during his lifetime fighting against imperialism, and for being a leading light in Africa as well, and, so it's been about 20 years now, hasn't it, that sanctions have been imposed on Zimbabwe. We overstand the challenges that come with the sanctions that have been imposed on the country, but nevertheless, we have to give a huge amount of credit to the Zimbabweans for their resilience, and for, their efforts, nevertheless, to still maintain a country that, seems to be working very effectively, everything is still moving. We know that there are challenges and that, the West is trying to make it as difficult as possible to try and cripple the economy, but nevertheless, we have to, acknowledge the fact that Zimbabweans have been very creative and very resilient in fighting against sanctions and just maintaining normality. And what a vast history there, and most of the history that you've shared with us, just hasn't been told in the way that you've told it here in the West, and the way that the parallels as well have been drawn between, our freedom fighters of time gone by over the centuries as well, and our techniques, our African techniques. Just goes to show, when fear is set aside, how we can, without even having the sophisticated, weaponry that our enemies may have, can still nevertheless, win these battles. But they will always try and win the war by, maintaining control and, by putting the pressure on from behind, the scenes. So it's been 20 years on since sanctions, and how are the people bearing up in Zimbabwe? Let's talk for another 10 minutes or so, and then open up the lines to callers who may want to call in. So how are the people bearing up, and in particular the economy? Because I know a lot of the sanctions has been primarily to hit the Zimbabwean economy. How are the people and how is the economy bearing up under the sanctions? Please.
I've always defined the sanctions as what we call total war. And I've called it total war because if we just call it an economic attack, then Zimbabwe can weather the economic attack, because 72% of Zimbabwe's population lives in villages. It lives outside the formal economy. So that would mean that the activities of those villages, which happen to do the mining, the farming, which is the main economic activities that keep the Zimbabwean economy alive, would be able to weather these challenges. Mm-hmm. But the problem that is in Zimbabwe is that because it is a total war, and because the total war is related to events that have happened in Zimbabwe before the sanctions themselves, becomes more encompassing. So let me explain what I'm saying to you. When Zimbabwe gets independence, it is asked to take on Rhodesian or colonial debt. Now, we already understand that when there's a colonial system on a country, that colonial system on a country pillages, rapes, and destroys an economy by basically taking wealth out of that economy to sustain Britain. So Zimbabwe had lost anything between $500 billion and $1 trillion during colonialism, from colonial taxes, loss of land, loss of livestock, and loss of resources, loss of labor that was never paid for. If you calculate that, it comes up to about $1 trillion or more. Then we then look at the fact that to be able to exploit Zimbabwe, the British government, through its colonial settlers, were incurring debt and investment to invest in exploiting stolen resources. That debt of, first of all, creating certain infrastructure, debt taken to buy weapons for the Rhodesians to stop our parents from taking independence, and debt created from building institutions that would then be used to exploit Zimbabwe, that debt was passed on to Zimbabwe. Now, I don't know if you just hear the irony of the fact that we paid for the weapons that were used to kill our ancestors.
Yeah.
And so that debt sat with Zimbabwe. There's a debt of about $800 million in 1980. And if you look at that debt in today's terms, and considering that it was a high interest debt that was taken during sanctions, some of it taken during sanctions, you will then understand that Zimbabwe's debt was about $2.8 billion in today's terms. We had to pay that debt. We did not get reparations from this colonial period. When we didn't get reparations, the British and the Americans, in cahoots with the South African apartheid government, asked the South African apartheid government to destabilize Zimbabwe. And to destabilize Zimbabwe through a number of ways, including this famous Gukurahundi. So what the Gukurahundi was about, it was about the South African colonial apartheid government creating a rebel force within Zimbabwe to destabilize Zimbabwe, to cause civil war in Zimbabwe, as they had done in Mozambique with a group called Renamo, and as they had done in Lesotho with a group called LLA, and as they had done in Angola with UNITA. The South African government, using its money that came in from Western companies that were in South Africa, and came in with the support of Western governments giving them weapons, went and created rebel forces in these countries. So in Zimbabwe, they created the rebel force called Super ZAPU. And as I told you, during our war, we had two factions, ZANU and ZAPU. So with the ZAPU gang, they had a few members who were disgruntled after the war. They lost the elections. After losing the elections, a number of very senior ZAPU people who were fighting in the bush during the liberation struggle didn't get the positions that they wanted. And so the apartheid government utilized ex-Rhodesians, who were ex-Britain, or Britons, let's call them, who infiltrated into some of these disgruntled guerrillas or disgruntled liberation fighters and said, listen, the Mugabe government, or ZANU, wants to take all the power. And so you guys have to fight to get a share of the pie. And so some of these disgruntled members began to leave the army. They began to defect and crossed over the border into training camps that had been set up by the South African apartheid government in Botswana. They started getting trained in in terrorism and trained in how to terrorize communities in Zimbabwe, particularly in Matabeleland, targeting a specific ethnic or tribal group to foment tribal conflict in Zimbabwe. And that is how Gukurahundi started. It started with members of this disgruntled ZAPU. And by the way, I need to state that ZAPU wasn't only made up of Ndebele, but it was subliminally perceived as a Ndebele path. And so they then went under disguise, or shall I say, as a covert force into Matabeleland, wearing Zimbabwean army uniforms, and they began to kill people as if the Zimbabwean government was deliberately killing Ndebele people to start a tribal war. And we understand that some of them were caught. When they were caught, weapons that were found in them were AK-47s made in Romania, that were made in 1981, years after the war. So these were not weapons that had been used during the war. These were not weapons given by the Russians during the war. these were weapons that had been given after the war by people that were trying to destabilize. And so there is evidence that some of that destabilization was being funded by the CIA, some of it was being funded by MI6, some of it was being funded by other right-wing groups in Europe to bring destabilization to Zimbabwe so that this black country that had just gotten independence would not work. The same has happened in Angola. The same has happened in Mozambique. The same was happening in Lesotho. So the evidence is there, and some of this evidence came out in the Truth and Reconciliation of South Africa. And there are 5 separate reports written, one by the CIA, one by Amnesty International, the Catholic Commission, Lawyers for Human Rights New York, and I think the Bulawayo Lawyers Project. All of these have written reports about Bukurahundi to say that the propaganda that 20,000 Ndebele people were murdered by the Mugabe government as a form of cleansing is not true. Because when you put it into context, in Africa we've already got a parallel of a genocide that happened in Rwanda. A genocide that was brought upon the people by people that were using machetes, who killed 1 million people in a period of 7 months. The Guerrilla took place for 5 years in Zimbabwe. And in those 5 years, they alleged 20,000 people died. And all the reports do not concur with that figure, that's first of all. But can we really believe that an army with guns, tanks, planes could only kill 20,000 Ndebeles if their intention was to wipe out 20,000 Ndebeles when they've got jets? Yet in Rwanda, 1 million people were killed just by machete. It doesn't make sense. But that is propaganda that has been advanced, particularly by ex-Rhodesians, the British media, American media, and the South African media that has always been white in apartheid and is still white today. And so it's important for us to understand that that disinformation was used to destabilize Zimbabwe in a period where Zimbabwe was under sanctions before the new sanctions were in. Sanctions by the South African destabilization, sanctions by colonial debt, sanctions by IMF coming into Zimbabwe to put in a structural adjustment program that was caused because Zimbabwe had money leaking from the system to fight the colonial debt issue. Money was leaking from the system to pay off these colonial debts. We got to a point where Zimbabwe had to even borrow money, forced by the IMF, forced by the World Bank, to borrow money to pay debts incurred during colonialism and during sanctions. And so by this time, Zimbabwe is trying to build schools, they're trying to build roads, they're trying to build hospitals. And so now when they run out of money, they had to go and borrow money from the World Bank and the IMF because they were given, because during the Lancaster House negotiations, the British and the Europeans promised a grant. So instead of getting reparations, they said, we will give you a grant. We'll assist you to develop Zimbabwe. We'll give you loans through the IMF, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. But some of those grants were not forthcoming. And so when Zimbabwe encountered a drought, one of the worst in 40 years, when it got independence, it had to borrow money. When it went to borrow those money, they were given terms by IMF that made sure that Zimbabwe would be in a perpetual cycle of debt. And when they had another drought in 1992, 10 years later, when they needed to borrow money to save people's lives again, the IMF this time decided to put what was called the Economic Structural Adjustment Program. All these were strategies by the West to ensure that Zimbabwe could not industrialize, ensure that Zimbabwe focused on cash crops instead of food self-sufficiency for its people, and that Zimbabwe focused on taking more debt to pay off previous debt instead of taking loans, debts, and grants to grow the Zimbabwean economy. And all these strategies were put, as they were put on Ghana, as they were put on every African country, to keep colonialism alive through financial markets, to keep colonialism alive through European or charter companies that would continue to operate in Zimbabwe or in Africa. And when Mugabe defied that, when he got to a point where he said, I'm no longer paying loans or paying back loans, I'm going to be building the country, which is what Thomas Sankara did as well, it started to cause him to have friction with the powers that be. Now, you need to understand that even though this is what happened with Mugabe was still able to build 5,709 schools in 20 years. He was able to build 13 universities. In fact, from a country that had one university, from a country that had only 174 secondary schools after 90 years of colonialism. The Rhodesians had only built 179 schools. Mugabe comes and he builds 5,700. He builds 1,600 odd clinics and hospitals. Out of 10,000 kilometers of road, he puts in 7,000 kilometers of road in 20 years. The man transformed Zimbabwe within a very short period of time. And he created some of the most educated people in Africa and the best education system in Africa in that 20 years. And now he was empowering those very same educated people to create a human talent that actually has economic power, which black people are not allowed according to the white supremacy system. That is what brought sanctions. And the sanctions were to stop this educated people, this human talent, from leveraging its resources and beginning to turn that leverage of resources into industrialization. What he needed to do is to stop educated Zimbabweans from using their land, to stop educated Zimbabweans from using their minerals and resources, and to stop educated Zimbabweans from taking the wealth that they were converting from their stock exchange, from control of companies, from control of the Reserve Bank, into industrial capacity, technology, innovation, and economic growth. And what sanctions have done is they've dispersed the Zimbabwean people. Right now, we understand that anything from 4 million to 6 million Zimbabweans have left Zimbabwe. So those are the brains of Zimbabwe. Those are the people with the capacity to create enterprise, to create businesses, to create industry. They've all been dispersed, including the man that created one of the biggest cellular networks in Southern Africa, owned by a black man, probably one of the biggest cellular networks in the world, owned by a black man. Strive Masiwa had to leave Zimbabwe and go into the diaspora. He did leave into the diaspora because of sanctions, partly, but also because he was answering to other masters beyond the Zimbabwean interest that then made him fall out with the Zimbabwean government. But irrespective of that fact, he was developed by the Zimbabwean policy. He was developed by Zimbabwe giving him a spectrum to be able to create a cellular network. He was developed by the empowerment by the Zimbabwean government. But the problem that we now have is not economic, because I think we can weather the economic problems that are brought by sanctions. The issue is division. The economic problems that are happening in the country being prohibited from exporting its exports because international banks are prohibited from processing Zimbabwean payments. By Zimbabwe not getting investment, we have had a decline in employment, and that is beginning to bring economic pain to those that haven't started business, to those that have not taken control of land or haven't applied for land, and those are the people that are becoming internal enemies of the system to cause division that the Americans are taking advantage of to try and use it to cause protests like the ones that we had in the Arab world, or protests that we had that just removed al-Bashir. And if that doesn't work, we feel that the Americans are going to try to turn this into some form of a civil unrest that they can then look for grounds to intervene in Zimbabwe as they did in Iraq, as they did in Libya. And that's what we are now fighting. We believe that we have got a strategy to fight sanctions, and that strategy to fight sanctions is not really about removing sanctions, but building unity. Because a united Zimbabwean people, if they can save together, if they can invest collectively what they save back into the economy, they can actually be able to raise this economy without foreign direct investment. Just Zimbabweans outside in the diaspora, 4 to 6 million Zimbabweans outside, are said to have more savings that any other country besides the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia outside their country, meaning that Zimbabweans have got savings to reinvest in Zimbabwe and raise the economy. But that's not happening because there is just no unity. There is just no home-biased investment mentality. And Zimbabweans just lack the confidence of knowing they don't need somebody from London, America, Australia investing in Zimbabwe, because we as Zimbabweans can invest and become the investors to raise that economy, and we bring our skills back from all the centers that we are in the diaspora, and we open up opportunities for people in the African diaspora, including African Americans, including Nigerians, including Ghanaians, to come and invest in Zimbabwe. We would be able to build it up, and with that, we would be able to say to the rest of Africa that you can take control of your resources and land and succeed, so that the rest of Africa can join Zimbabwe in doing exactly the same thing for us to control our resources and grow our country.
Wow, thank you, my brother. What an incredible history Zimbabwe has had, and such a challenging one as well. But nevertheless, the people, remain, resilient to all of this. And it's good to hear where you've landed there, my brother, about the potential strategy going forward for Zimbabwe, because the country has tried its utmost to work with the West. It's tried to adhere to agreements and uphold their side of the agreements, and we've seen time and time again over the decades how the West have just reneged on their agreements, where they've allowed the country to enter into financial agreements which has just not been in the interest of the country at all. We can see now as well, with a growing youth population, that the country really does need to get to grips with what it does to provide opportunities for the youth, to avoid, as you were saying, that potential civil unrest. Let me give out the telephone number. Actually, just open up the lines. Hopefully, most of you got the telephone number that we gave out earlier. We welcome you to call in and, put any points or questions to our brother. I hope it will work and that he'd be able to hear you, because I have actually got him on loudspeaker on WhatsApp, which isn't the way we like to communicate, but we can give it a try. The number that you need to call in on to interact with our dear brother is 0207 193 0174. We might be able to take just one or two calls before we round up this part of the show, because we've got another guest that's going to be calling in round about 12 noon. But I'd like to give you the opportunity to put any questions you may have or points you might want to raise to our dear brother Rutendo, who's given us an incredible, background and a very insightful, view of what's been going on in South Africa. Told us so many stories that, we've just not read anywhere, not written about, stories that are being told from those on the ground with the experience of what has actually been going on in Zimbabwe. So if you want to give us a call and contribute to the discussion, you are most welcome to do so. But until then, let me go back to our brother Rutendo, because going forward, absolutely agree with you. It's looking at how the diaspora outside of Zimbabwe can work collectively with the Zimbabweans, to start those industries, those manufacturing companies, those factories, utilizing the land that it has through farming, etc., and getting its hands on the equipment that's needed, or making the equipment, Zimbabweans making the equipment themselves, or going back to traditional ways of farming, whatever the technique is, but to start utilizing that land in such a way that it's producing produces that, can not only benefit all of the people in its country, but its neighbors as well, neighboring countries and other friendly countries that will work with and support Zimbabwe. You have, as you said, a very prosperous Zimbabwean diaspora, You've got a new government as well, so it's almost like a new dispensation. And I know that government, when it first came in, was trying to attract businesses to come in, you know, to do business with Zimbabwe. And we've seen the sabotage of those efforts as well. But, you know, we've still got to continue trying to generate that income. Let me just also mention an article that I've come across that's talking about an international football player. He was a former, I think he was Chelsea football player actually, football player, Didier Drogba. He's from Côte d'Ivoire, and he went on a road show to promote Côte d'Ivoire to businesses, and he's managed to come back with $15 billion worth of commitments from businesses to invest in the tourism sector in Côte d'Ivoire. And when I read this, I thought, this is the way forward. Could this be the way forward, you know, for African countries, rather than look to China, rather than go cap in hand to the IMF or the World Bank, rather than look to India or even Europe? You know, what he did, he took, you know, his country and the potential benefits for tourism in his country on a roadshow to Dubai and Hamburg, and returned with $15 billion more, it says, than $15 billion worth of funding commitments for a variety of tourism projects, from hotels to resorts to coastline developments, mixed-use products, you know. Let's make sure, thank you, that because I needed to restart my computer, I also need to restart Skype, I think. I think Skype is now up. If you want to call in, the lines are open. Until we get a call or two coming through, back to my brother Rutendo. Did you hear what I was saying about Drogba's roadshow? Okay, there's a caller coming in. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Greetings, caller. Who do we have on the line?
Yeah, greetings, Sista Shanice. Triple X on the line.
Rise up, my brother. Also just adding brother Akram to the line. Greetings. Go ahead. I'm just going to turn you up as well. Go ahead, my brother.
Yeah, good morning to all the Galaxy listeners. What a fascinating insight into the real truth of Zimbabwe and the history. And he explained it so articulately and so in depth. And, you know, mostly what I'm really upset about.
Before you continue, my brother, let me just check if our brother can hear, or if he's able to listen through a separate listening device. My brother Rutendo, are you able to hear the caller on the line?
No, I can't hear the caller on the line.
Oh, I didn't think so. Are you able to listen through a separate listening device, like a radio or a laptop that you can use to listen?
Give me the what you call it?
Okay. The link is in your emails, the www.galaxy.afiwi listen live link. Okay. Continue, my brother Triple X. I might need to just recap on what you're saying.
Yeah, like I was saying, it's like great ways to explain everything about the history of Zimbabwe and the wars and the political situation and the wickedness of the white man and the Western world in trying to destabilize Zimbabwe. You know, I've known this for a long time, and like, even when we went out there on holiday and we met up with Grace Mugabe, we sat down in depth.
Yeah, brother Kwame, I've just added you to the group, and brother Akram, I think I've got you in the group as well, but please put your phones on mute. Thank you. So my brother Rutendo, brother Triple X is rising you up. Please continue, brother Triple X.
Yeah, and she told us a similar story, and we even got to know about the cellular scouts and all the people who died when they in Matabele land, the uprising, and they just wanted to create a civil war from the beginning. And up till now, they don't want Zimbabwe to run properly. That's why they keep the sanctions. Imagine a country for 20 years you've been in sanctions, and you have to pay back off debts that you was fighting. The war, the tanks, the weaponry. You've had to pay all that off just to get back on track, and then build schools and get your country running. And on top of that, you get saboteurs throwing acid in your water and poisoning your land and killing your cattle. this is what white people have done to Zimbabwe after independence, and you had to fight all these oppressions and still get on top. And on top of that, you still can't get, freedom. You still can't get, but what I'm really upset about the most is the way the outside world, especially the African countries, has helped Zimbabwe enough, in my opinion, I mean, when you see all, they've like conspire to like destabilize the country, and like the man said before, they would like it to be turned into Iraq or Syria, so they can go in and mash it up and take away all their resources like they've done with the oil from Syria and Iraq and Libya. This is what America is like, and this is what Britain is like, and this is what the West does. So people now, I want you to know that when you listen to the truth of things, don't just let the media brainwash you, because people are telling you the truth of what's happening. So when you hear the truth of what's happening, write down and support each other. Support each other as black people in businesses, in our countries and everything, until we can rise up. And people living outside of Zimbabwe, that come from Zimbabwe, not just people who are not Zimbabweans, born there, all people, let's rally around and help the Zimbabwean economy and the people to be better, like going there on holiday, meeting the people and seeing people and, getting involved in Africa and getting involved in our just let's unite as a people, because we need to do that. And until we can do that, we're never going to reach anyway. That's what I've got to say.
Rise up yourself, brother Triple X. I did put the earphones next to the mic in the hope that our brother Rutendo could hear it through the headphones. Were you able to hear some of what was said through the headphones, my brother?
Yes, I was able to hear what Triple X was saying, and he makes some very brilliant points. In the aspect that Africa has not stood up with Zimbabwe, he's very correct.
Yes.
One of the major reasons why I've had to start an institution that is called Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions is that if Zimbabweans ourselves are not united in fighting for Zimbabwe, if we're not united to fighting against America, which in this case is the representation and symbolism of imperialism, we mustn't expect other countries to stand with us. However, I do believe that Zimbabwe has played an integral role in not only fighting for Zimbabwean independence from imperialism, but by sending this Zimbabwean soldiers to Mozambique to save Mozambique from the destabilization by the apartheid South African government, by sending Zimbabwean soldiers into Congo. Zimbabwe has played a very integral part of fighting imperialism. Hence, you will not find AFRICOM in Southern Africa, because we've been able to contain some of our problems through countries like Zimbabwe going across borders to assist other countries. So I think Zimbabwe now, in its state of weakness, deserves the same assistance and support against a total war that is not about military yet, but for now it is about unity, economic support, breaking sanctions, trading as a region and as a continent for us to be able to beat these economic weapons so that we can counter any attempt to destabilize the country and to bring war to the country, which could end up being war for the region.
Yes, indeed. Rise up, Triple X. Thank you for that response there, Brother Rutendo. Let's bring in Brother Kwame. Sorry, Brother Akram, I was trying to add you, but unfortunately wasn't able to do so. But let's quickly bring in Brother Kwame.
Greetings.
Greetings, Brother Kwame. Go ahead, my brother.
I've got 3 points to ask the brother, but before I do so, in terms of the sanctions as a weapon of war, it is very, very true that is a device that these wicked white people use to try and, railroad their agenda in Africa. So, for example, they use sanctions against Asajafo when they knew that Asajafo was a threat to their interest on the continent. So they used, they didn't use sanctions per se, but what they did was that they sabotaged the price of cocoa, because at that time cocoa was Ghana's biggest export. So what they did was to sabotage the price of cocoa, meaning that Nkrumah would not get the money that was needed to fund the various projects that he was doing in Ghana at the time, because he had massive plans to reindustrialize Ghana. And that was one of the ways in which they were able to foment public agitation against Nkrumah. That made it easier for the West to actually, organize and plot a coup d'etat in Ghana that led to the overthrow exactly 57 years ago, 54 years ago this week. So they've always used sanctions being a weapon of war that they've done towards pushing their agenda on the continent. And on top of that, I would ask all our people who are listening, whether you're in the continent or whether in diaspora, to please read a book called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Now, this book goes into detail, just like Asadifil's neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, goes into detail and how these Western people will never ever let go of their grip on the continent. So a classic example of this case is Gaddafi. So they used sanctions on Gaddafi because they knew.
Sorry about that. Brother Kwame, if you can make your concluding point now. I've got 6 minutes before the top of the hour and I've got 2 other callers trying to come through.
Okay, right.
So just a final 30 seconds, please, my brother.
Okay, so my question is, one, did he think that the Lancaster House Conference was a con plan? 2, does he think, why, the question that I want to ask is that why doesn't Zimbabwe, seek assistance from rich Africans like Dangote, Kwame Osei Despite in Ghana, rich Africans like that can help, with the redevelopment of Zimbabwe, as opposed to going to India and China. And thirdly, does he think that Nkrumah should have been the leader rather than Mugabe? And what would have happened had Nkrumah led the negotiations or not being removed from the scene rather than putting Mugabe in there? Give thanks.
Wow, 3 heavy questions there, my brother. Thank you for those questions. Let's clear the line now. I've seen a couple of other callers trying to come through, and I think there's going to have to be a part 2 with our brother if he can spare the time, because those 3 big questions, I don't think he's going to have time enough to respond. But let me give him just 2 minutes whilst we clear the lines. Over to you, my brother.
Yeah, he's very right. And for me, Osagyefo was under sanctions by a mere fact that he was the only independent, Ghana was the only independent country by the time that Osagyefo took over, meaning that he was surrounded by enemy states that were still under colonial control. He had no one to trade with. That isolation in its own respect was sanctions. And then when you look at the deal that was signed when the Volta was created, and the fact that the company that created the Volta Dam would not allow uranium smelter to be put in Ghana, because they feared that Ghana would then be able to have an upper hand in negotiations, was sanctions. It was sabotage. So Ghana was the first.
Oh, my brother. Are you still there? Okay, we lost you for a second. Right, let me just quickly bring in another caller. We're going to have to, if it's okay with you, have a part 2. Let me find out who we've got on the line. Greetings, caller. Who do we have on the line?
Rise up, Sista Shanice. I will be very quick. And I solidarity with the brother in Zimbabwe. But what I have to say, the great, the people that are against them in sanctions, we have to. I spoke to a sister and I showed them about your goat farming.
Yeah, we got 3 minutes before the top of the hour. I'm going to invite the brother to come back, one, so that he can respond in full to Brother Triple X and also to Brother Kwame, make your point, and then I'm going to have to ask him to just sum up in 2 minutes.
Well, Sister Shanice, I thank you for your time. And we know about the history, so Brother Kwame and Triple X and all of what. Also, we are aware of these wicked sanctions that holding our people, and we are fighting against it in this time. From our side, these wicked governments that are holding our people in sanctions and aid.
Yes, my brother.
Wickedness.
rise yourself up. I'm sorry to have to cut you short only because of time. But yes, thanks for leaving our brother with the knowledge that we are supporting and fighting from this end as well, and look to support and are here to support our brothers. Yes, and that we're looking to support our brothers in any way that we can. My brother Rutendo, it's saying that you're reconnecting. Brother Lee, I know I've got you on the line. Please hold. Thank you so much. Brother Rutendo, we lost you for a moment, but we're going to have to invite you back at a date and time that's convenient for you. But I wonder if you could just leave us with a few departing words.
Yes, Sister Shanice. Can you hear me?
Yes, hearing you loud and clear.
All right, brilliant. Right, just to touch on a few questions so that I can conclude with them. Somebody asked that, I think it was Brother Kwame, you asked why is it that we don't partner with African business people. The issue that we've got with a lot of African business people is that we do reach out to them. Countries are reaching out to them, but they tend to have a phobia to invest in Africa. So Dangote himself has been to Zimbabwe, and when he left Zimbabwe, all he was talking about was there is corruption in Zimbabwe. And the same Dangote then goes and he pledges $50 billion to invest that in Britain and America. So, and then you've got Strive Masiwa from Zimbabwe who invest in Zimbabwe, but at the same time externalizes a large amount of money from Zimbabwe to invest in the West. So a lot of us are beginning to question, are these African business people pro-African? Are these African people sponsoring Africa? And are these African people financed by Africa because they tend to have a phobia once they've made their billion in Africa, which I find very ironic. They talk about corruption in Africa, forgetting that the greatest corruption is in the West, the sanctions, the wars for oil, and all this sabotage of Africa is actually corruption. Colonialism was corruption. They don't talk about that. They don't talk about reparations, but they criticize African countries for being corrupt. Yet every country in the world is corrupt, and we never hear Europeans denouncing their countries for being corrupt. So my question is, are African business people willing to invest in Africa once they have milked Africa, harvested the African market, taken billions from Africa, become billionaires, they start bad-mouthing the very same Africa that made them rich? Then we also have the question of Joshua Nkomo. Joshua Nkomo, had he been the one to negotiate the Lancaster House Conference, would we be in a better off position? I don't believe so, because Joshua Nkomo was the preferred president for Zimbabwe by the Europeans, by Ian Smith, because he was more palatable to control of whites over blacks. He had accepted a constitutional amendment and negotiation in 1961 that says that Europeans would have 44 seats while Africans had 15 seats. So he was not the right person to liberate Zimbabwe. He would not have carried out the land reform. He would not have aggressively radicalized, transformed the market. And his soldiers were not fighting when the Zanla soldiers were fighting because he was busy negotiating with Ian Smith. And he was in cahoots with Kaunda to have a negotiated settlement instead of a military settlement to the Zimbabwean question.
My brother Rutendo, these and so many more questions yet to be answered, and we've got the second part of the show that needs to start now. The information that you've been providing for us today has been invaluable. It's been an incredibly interesting and steep learning curve, and we do need to look now at how, African businesses and entrepreneurs can actually contribute to being the change that we want to see. So my brother, please, if we invite you back, I hope that you'll accept our invitation. We'll get Skype sorted between now and then, all being well. I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Galaxy Afiwi. Now that you've introduced yourself to the family, don't be a stranger.
Thank you so much, Sister Shanice. Thank you for the opportunity. And just in parting, please, can people support our initiative, Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions, or ZWAWUS? We need as much support from people in terms of material, kind, intellectual contributions for us to take this fight forward, because it's not a Zimbabwean fight, it's a pan-African fight, which starts with the symbol of decolonization, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Ghana, becoming more self-sufficient and more progressive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. One love, my brother. That was our dear brother Rutendo calling in from South Africa, and I want to thank the entire family for your patience with the connections there. It wasn't the best, but we were able nevertheless to still hear from my brother. And we have another brother on the line, Brother Lee. We're going to go over to Lee in just a moment. Just going to bring you a little brief just going to have a little brief interlude, just 2 minutes, with a bit of a track from Buju Banton. Stand up and defend your rights, which is what we need to be doing as a people, locally, nationally, and internationally.
This is the Black Empowerment Show with Sista Shanice, giving you an African-centered worldview perspective. Keep it locked this way, it's the real deal. Bucket your sada. But that thing, play by the great king.